Race matter. So now the style of the debate is going to be 6 rounds, or no, 3 rounds. And it's going to be 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 4 minutes, 4 minutes. And so for the, okay, and then what's going to happen is once the debate ends, you guys are all going to write your names and your votes on the tickets. We're going to collect your tickets, and we're going to do the raffle and also tell you who won the debate.
To give you a little bit of background information, this debate will be discussing affirmative action policies across college campuses. To give you a little bit of background information, affirmative action is a practice that began in the 1960s. It was designed as an agenda to address historic discrimination that's faced by ethnic minorities, women, and other underrepresented groups. The aim is to foster diversity and to compensate for ways that these groups have been excluded over years. So we've got the proposition, who's going to be supporting that affirmative action policies should exist across college campuses. And then we've got the opposition, and they are against affirmative action policies.
So I just want to introduce our speakers that we have here, the 4 of them. On the opposition side, we have Dan Milyovsky and Luke Kusik, who are college libertarians and members of the Binghamton Review. And on the proposition side, we have Trevor Reddick, assistant coach of the Binghamton Speech and Debate team, and Joe Weil, assistant professor of English, poetry, and fiction, labor organizer, and union rep. So our first speaker is Trevor.
Okay, hi everybody. Happy to be here. Let's have a good debate. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about what affirmative action is for college acceptances. In the United States, a prominent form of racial preferences relates to access to education, particularly admission to universities and other forms of higher education. Race, ethnicity, native language, social class, geographical origin, parental attendance of the university in question, and/or gender are sometimes taken into account when the university assesses an applicant's grades and test scores. Individuals can also be awarded scholarships and have fees paid on the basis of criteria listed above. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled in Bakke versus Regents that public universities and other government institutions could not set specific numerical targets based on race for admissions or employment. The court said that goals and timetables for diversity could be set instead. Second, affirmative action is more of a process than just an admissions policy. Colleges and universities reach out to groups that are underrepresented and urge students to apply. Institutions often offer financial aid to underrepresented students and provide on-campus support programs to improve their academic success. I have a few reasons why we should have affirmative action. First is the ethical imperative upon all of us, especially here at Binghamton University. There is a history of racial exclusion in America that must be addressed. Specifically, I'd like to take your attention to New York City and Long Island, the main lifelines of this university and places that a lot of us call home. I want to bring your attention to the racist housing policies which are currently gentrifying New York City boroughs, increasing economics of our particular area by pricing out poor blacks and pushing them into hyper-ghettos around the New York City boroughs. The history of places like Levittown, Long Island, are national examples of the racialized history of economic development which infect enrollment and access today. Levittown was created in the mid-1900s by federal housing grants to Levitt & Sons for whites-only construction. That's right, the federal government founded and funded whites-only developments in the places that we live. Whites were sold houses which now sell at 7 times American median income. And as of 2010, less than 1% of Levittown was black. And not only was community building deterred, but there was no opportunity for wealth development within these communities as well. As Ira Katznelson documents in his 2013 book, Fear Itself, The New Deal, which indicates that blacks have been denied access to minimum wage, Social Security, and protections of the National Labor Relations Act, among any other labor rights, by excluding the occupations in which they were primarily black people, specifically agriculture and domestic service. All of these constitute historical instances of racist wealth accumulation, which disproportionately exclude black families from having the economic security to set their kids up for much less pay for a college education. Richard Rothstein, Senior Fellow at the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the UC Berkeley School of Law, writes in 2014 that we cannot calculate specific debts owed to African Americans whose government denied them the opportunity in violation of constitutional rights to purchase suburban homes and then benefit from equity appreciation. But in principle, we can calculate some consequences of our racial history. But repayment to these workers or their heirs of such losses is politically, if not practically, inconceivable. In this context, extending small college admission preferences to otherwise qualified descendants of slaves and those subject to Jim Crow laws is a modest step. Second is that we believe that affirmative action is the best for achieving all universities' main missions: education. Lee Bollinger, president of Columbia University and former president of University of Michigan during its affirmative action case, gave a speech in 2002 affirming diversity as a compelling interest for all universities, when he said that ethnic and racial diversity within a university setting is absolutely essential to the accomplishment of a university's missions, and is at the very core of what a university does. Interacting with peoples of different backgrounds creates the environment in which learning and empathy are fostered. The opportunity to come to a greater understanding of others' points of views and how their life experiences might have caused them to be who they are and form the opinions that they hold. Grappling with race in America is a powerful instance of crossing sensibilities of all kinds, part of the core of great education. Third is the economics. Business owners and corporate entities have a direct interest in hiring from diverse learning environments. Lee Bollinger continues in 2004 when he discusses the people and corporations that supported their bid for affirmative action. He says that they were supported by the Association of American Universities, the American Council on Education, the Department of Justice, churches, labor unions, General Motors, and 20 other Fortune 500 corporations. The corporations argue in their brief, given to the Supreme Court, that racial and ethnic diversity in higher education is vital to their efforts to hire and maintain an effective workforce prepared for the opportunities presented by a global economy. Managers and employers who graduated from institutions with diverse student bodies demonstrate creative problem solving by integrating differing perspectives, exhibit the skills required for good teamwork, are better prepared to understand, learn from, and collaborate with persons from other racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds, and are more responsive to the needs of all customers. Our opponents are going to argue, potentially, that this is unconstitutional. However, this is a misreading of the Constitution based on an ahistorical understanding of racialized oppression. The status quo is significant underrepresentation of blacks as a result of 400 years of economic disenfranchisement, which means that only a reading of affirmative action as a mechanism for establishing equal protection and equal opportunity in public universities, not the other way around. And SCOTUS justices agree, as Richard Rothstein continues. Instead of winks, nods, and disguises, Ginsburg has called for race-conscious policy to offset the still enduring effects of slavery and the subsequent unconstitutional exploitation of its descendants under Jim Crow. Only an ostrich could regard the supposedly neutral alternatives as race-unconscious, Ginsburg has said, and only a contorted legal mind can conclude that an admissions policy designed to produce racial diversity is not race-conscious. Sotomayor recently added that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race, and to apply the Constitution with eyes open to the unfortunate effects of centuries of racial discrimination. Our opponents may also argue that affirmative action doesn't work, but it does, and canceling it is devastating to diversity initiatives. The National Conference of State Legislatures published on their website that affirmative action programs have resulted in doubling or tripling the number of minority applications to colleges or universities, and to make colleges and universities more representative of their surrounding community, something we significantly need here. Statistics show that after California abolished its affirmative action programs in 1998, the minority students admissions at UC Berkeley fell 61%, and minority admissions at UCLA fell 36%. After Texas abolished its affirmative action program in 1996, Rice University's freshman class had 46% fewer African Americans and 22% fewer Hispanic students. I think this is emblematic of a serious issue within America, and that there's no way to talk about Constitution or the history of America without understanding the racial violence which continues today. Thank you.
for a year and a half. Stepped down this past semester, so I'm a known figure in the political world here, and agreed to do this debate basically like 12 hours ago, so didn't prepare like a whole speech, but I just jotted down some points that I'd like to address. So the last thing we heard is about college applications, but what's a more important metric is the graduation rate. And after they abolished affirmative action in California in the public school system, the graduation rate among minorities actually jumped pretty significantly. So yes, you did have less minorities at the most prestigious schools, but overall minorities did graduate. What's the point of having people in college if they're just going to drop out because perhaps they don't have the skills to go to that particular college? It's better to match them to an institution that can teach at a level appropriate to the skills they've developed. Otherwise, if they just drop out, they've wasted all this money, they've wasted all this time, and they get discouraged. So that's not a good policy. As to the minorities who do have the skills, affirmative action creates a stigma for them because many people have said that they don't like it, that they feel that there's a sneaking suspicion that people think that they're just there just because they benefited from affirmative action, and that really hurts their self-esteem. So it hurts minorities by creating that sort of stigma. An affirmative action system that's just income-based would make more sense, since a study by the Hoover Institution has showed that affirmative action disproportionately benefits upper class and middle class minorities. So Obama actually addressed this himself when George Stephanopoulos asked him whether his own daughter should benefit from affirmative action. He said, "The girls should probably be treated by any admissions officer as folks who are pretty advantaged." And that makes sense, just like if you think about it on an abstract level. Should Obama's daughters get preference over maybe like some white people in the middle of West Virginia and Appalachia? Maybe like their parents are making $15,000 a year. Do they have like further advantages just because they have less melanin in their skin? Probably not. In terms of diversity, diversity is great. We want other forms of diversity, not just racial. We want diversity of experience, we want diversity of intellectual viewpoints, political ideologies, and such. And that's really not being stressed. And to think that just all minorities like think the same way, that's actually a form of racism. We want we want diversity in more ways than that. For certain institutions like medical school, don't you only want to use the factors which are relevant to admission? So for medical school, the factors that admissions officer will typically look at is your MCAT score, your GPA, your experiences volunteering at a hospital, shadowing doctors. Do you really want skin color to be a criteria for that? We want the best doctors in America. We don't want people selected because of their skin color. And everyone should be judged equally. Also, at what point, I would ask our opponents, have we reached the point at which we no longer need affirmative action? Affirmative action was created to be a remedial sort of program. We've had it for over 25 years now. What is the exact threshold that we have to reach in order to end it? Furthermore, you mentioned Levittown and the government subsidizing homes for white people. That's totally true, and the U.S. federal government has been completely racist in the past. So why would you trust that very same government now to fix the problems it created? It is completely absurd. As for wealth accumulation, the people that suffer the most from affirmative action in California are Asian immigrants who arrived here with nothing. They didn't have any wealth accumulation. So there's a quote here I'd like to read that's spoken by Peter Thiel. He said, "Why should the underqualified son of a black doctor displace the qualified daughter of a Vietnamese boat refugee? If you're only looking at race, then like you're losing out on all that." A racist past shouldn't be undone with more racism. It just doesn't make sense to look at someone's skin color and make a decision based on who they are based on that. Also, you talked about Jim Crow, but affirmative action doesn't just benefit blacks, it also benefits Latinos, it benefits African immigrants who were not affected by slavery in America and by Jim Crow. So the actual only minority of people who benefit from affirmative action are descendants of slaves in America. So if you're talking about compensating those people for what their ancestors suffered, that would be a different issue than the way affirmative action is practiced in America today. It's basically all the points I have right now.
Hi, I'm Professor Weil, and I'm going to speak from a narrative paradigm, meaning I'm going to speak from my experience. As you can tell, I'm relatively old compared to my audience. All right. First of all, would you want somebody to operate on you on the basis of their color? It's strange because the first open heart surgery performed in America was by an African American. In a time when it was almost impossible for an African American to be a surgeon. If he had been denied that surgery, and he had been denied that ability to develop open heart surgery, thousands would have died. So the argument is rather, it's a rather simplistic argument. As far as the narrative paradigm goes, my own experience, my opponent said, my esteemed opponent, I respect his views. I'm a reformed libertarian. I'm an anarcho-syndicalist, which is a more fancy word for libertarian. It means that I believe in group anarchy rather than individualism. All right? I worked in a place called Hyatt Roller Bearing, which was one of the first worker-owned factories in America. It ran in the black for 3 years, meaning it had made a profit. GM realized that this was setting a bad precedent, pulled its contract from us, took away its roller bearings, and we were out of business in 2 years, and it became a golf course. All right? All of us have experienced the different insidious ways in which laws can be circumvented. Affirmative action hasn't even begun to be implemented. We can't say it's been tested and failed. It has never been allowed to succeed. The number one beneficiary of affirmative action were white middle-class women. And that's good, because white middle-class women in the 60s had a glass ceiling. Your mothers, if anybody here had mothers, or a white mother, if you want to put it that way, I've had a white mother. She didn't work in the 60s. She stayed home. All right? And my father worked in a factory. And I worked in a factory for 20 years before I became a professor. So if we want to talk about exceptional cases, I'm certainly an exceptional case. All right? You cannot base fairness, a civil culture, a polis, basic human decency on exceptions. This is not to be tolerated. The very constitutional basis of the American way, so to speak, is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Anything that impedes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and I think one of the major impediments is economics and the level of jobs you work and what you're allowed to do, right, is unconstitutional. The truth is that the two words on which America is based are extension and election. Election first. Who are the elect? In the early days of America, the elect were certain small group of Puritans who saw themselves as God's elect, and freedoms and democratic freedoms and assembly were accorded to them, and only to them. Later, it was those white men who owned property. The definition of white has not been established. It still has yet to be established. Irish were not allowed, when they first came here, Irish Catholics, to put themselves down as white until the 1890s. They were not allowed to define themselves as white. All right? So what we are looking at is we're looking at a situation that's a phantasmagoria. In my factory, everything was run as prison cliques. People protected their own interests in ways that circumvented the unions, circumvented the laws. All right? This is a direct quote from one of my upper managers. Well, Joe, I know Leon's been working for us for 20 years, and he's a great guy, but I'm sorry, but those Vietnamese guys are just so much better with computers. We can't give them a shot at the CNC machine. And I said, are you willing to put that on in writing? He says, give me a minute. He says, no. I'm not willing to put that, because he knew if he put that in writing, not only would he be sued, but he would have his whole case blown. I go, so flawless record for 20 years. So on what do you base your decision except a generality? And people will say, okay, well, see, that's because he was not colorblind. See, we have to be colorblind. it's an impossibility to be colorblind. I do not believe in it. I grew up working class. I know that people are not colorblind. Right? People are not going to eradicate color. Why should they? Why? But fairness is a fundamental dream of America. Whether affirmative action has succeeded yet in creating fairness is a question that my opponents might bring up. And it has failed, they'll say. But if that's true, so has the pursuit of life, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for a great majority of people. Certain laws are what you would call ideals. They are towards, a towards. Without that towards, we fall back. Without the idea that we can move towards integration, we can move towards racial fairness, we can move towards a more equitable, diverse culture. Without even that possibility, we will fall back. I know this firsthand. Whenever I have seen a situation in which affirmative action can be circumvented, whenever I've seen a subtle way in which a woman working in a factory who went and pressed a sexual harassment case, she would win, but she would lose. Because she would win the case and then, oh, Dolores, you didn't have your safety glasses on 1 minute after break. Rule and regulation warning. The full letter of the law was hammered down on her. And she was not, and she was fired. I would have to circumvent the law by saying, well, the one thing that they really get scared about is being sued for their safety hazards. So here was somebody that couldn't even use their own law. She was having her body touched by foremen, and she could not implement affirmative action because they would live by the letter of the law, but by the spirit, they would kill it. Since the early 1980s, affirmative action has been killed in spirit everywhere, challenged everywhere. It has not been allowed to flourish. Even white middle-class women who had benefited most have gone down since the 80s in their job opportunities. Nada. Right? It's a myth. The myth out there is that affirmative action is a quota system. First of all, that's intrinsically illegal in the United States. The myth out there is that somehow it jeopardizes white middle-class futures. That's a myth proven by statistics. You pretty much end up wherever your parents were. Maybe a little lower now. It's the first time in history we actually can expect to be lower than our parents were economically. First time. So we're frightened. And we tend to demonize when we're frightened. And we tend to overreact. The truth is that affirmative action is an attempt to bring a whole group of people up from a legal discrimination, a legal racism. The difference between discrimination and racism is that racism was legal in this country until the 1960s. It wasn't a nebulous, emotional prejudice. It was a legal way of deciding who was favored, who had advantages, and who didn't. And affirmative action is a corrective to that gross injustice. Thank you.
Found out I was doing this about 12 hours ago too, and I left the notes that I wrote my college homework instead, so I don't have my notes prepared for me right here, but I can do my best. So, what happened in affirmative action in college was happening in the 80s, but in 1961, under JFK, affirmative action started when he stated that he wanted to more diversify the federal employees. At the time, in the federal government, especially in Washington, D.C., and the bureaucracies that were existed and created, African Americans and minorities of sorts were not allowed, or not even allowed, were just not participating well in that area, meaning they weren't hired. So what they did was that they wanted to expand upon that. Lyndon Johnson in 1965 said that, oh, I'm paraphrasing of course, but he said, a race of people who have been chained by slavery and chained by laws for years and years, and then when they are unchained, thrown out, and told to compete are not at the same line as other ones who are able to compete for him. So that's a very good point. That point is that what the injustices of slavery and the injustices of Jim Crow, African Americans were, of course, not at the same place as white Americans at the time, because they were allowed to freely compete. So then, Thomas Sowell, in 1988, was asked the question, well, because when you look at the statistics of like Africans coming from actually Africa compared to whites here, they're doing statistically better. Their children are going to better colleges. Their children are making more money, and they're exceeding their parents. So he was asked, why is it that African Americans in America are seemingly not making to this goal? To Thomas Sowell, he was asked this question, and why is it that the whites are continuing to progress? And Sowell answered, honestly, whites haven't stopped progressing. You guys were held down by slavery. But then to say now that people who had nothing to do with it are to suffer, which they really aren't that suffering, but then to now have this system in place that actually is not working out as it should be. Now, they're saying the proposition has said that there's no proof that affirmative action has not been working. However, a study done by the ACT and by I forget the other group that did it, they co-joined this study at the University of Michigan, the place where it was famous for the quota laws, where the Supreme Court said that quotas are not allowed because of a University of Michigan case. Famous place. They had a comparison between whites, Asians, and black students who were accepted and in the freshman class of that year, and how they did compared to each other in areas such as math, English, science, and social studies. What they found, on average, was that Asian students far exceeded the expectations, whereas the African American students, unfortunately, were not. And the white students were at par or below par. So what does that mean? That means that some people are going to the school, unfortunately, statistically speaking, African Americans more than any other race just because of what happened, not people actually attending more African. The people who are affected by this study are going to a school in which they are not competing and not excelling at the same level as everyone else that is supposed to be the set level. So what does that mean? That means you're being put into an institution that is not helping you out. And our opponents also pointed out that when what happened in the University of Berkeley, California, that as soon as you pulled away affirmative action, there were less black people in that school. That's true. However, as my partner rightly pointed out, there were more black students graduating from California state colleges. What does that mean? That means you are actually getting better. You're progressing. As we said, you need to progress. The professor's point was that we have laws in place in order to have an ideal. You don't need laws to have ideals. We all have our own ideals. And what we need is actual progress. How do we progress? Through school, through all the stuff that we have. Affirmative action is not helping, it's hurting. Because when you're dropping out of school, when you maybe get in, when you don't go, when the graduation rate isn't the best for African American students at this time, you're not excelling, you're not progressing. So then, as the professor pointed out, this law has helped white women in particular, middle-class white women. And as he pointed out, in his own case, his white mother was not able to work, was told to stay in yes. My same grandmother, when she came here from Albania, had no choice but to work as a white woman. And my white grandfather had no choice but to work. And they had 9 kids. It wasn't, the society, of course, didn't look down on a woman working, but you can still do. You might get looked down upon, but you still do. And what has affirmative action done, as my partner rightly pointed out, it takes the African American students at colleges now, and they're looked down upon. They're saying, people are saying, oh, you got in because you were black. Oh, you got in, you're a quota. They don't even know what affirmative action is, but that's what they instantly think of you. Why is that? That's because of the institution that has been in place. Just like Jim Crow institutionally excluded African Americans from certain places, institutionally made African Americans have black and white colored thousands. What does that do? It institutionally makes you someone less, into the eyes of your peers. Now, of course, the hope, the ideal that we're all looking at is the point that, black people and white people are going to all go and everyone's going to do great. But unfortunately, statistically, it's not true. Statistically speaking, people that come from outside of this country into this country do better than white people and black people combined. Asians coming from, like you said, a Vietnamese boat refugee coming in will statistically, what?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, my bad. Will do statistically better than a white person on average. And as we pointed out, that women are accepting more. There are more women in college right now than men. So it's not as if there is no evidence that affirmative action is working. What the working is now you put more women in there, and you're affecting people that you shouldn't really weren't aiming for. You were aiming for the people who were supposedly disenfranchised. What it should be, though, is based on economics. It should be based on your employment. As my partner rightly pointed out with the Obama quote, my daughter should be treated just as a pretty advantaged folk. She's the daughter of the president of the country. She's going anywhere. You put whatever her first name, Obama, she's getting into Yale, Harvard, Columbia, no matter what. That's just true. You have, just like the Bushes got into any college they wanted, and the Bushes were all alcoholics. They were Bush. They got in because of their name. That happens. Sorry, that's how it happens sometimes. And we don't want underqualified people. Why should the underqualified son of a black doctor displace the qualified daughter of a Vietnamese boat refugee? Why? There's no ethical reason for it. There's no grounded reason for it. This is all about ethics, he said, that we've disenfranchised, we've done all this stuff. The government has done all this awful, all this sin to the black community. But then the government's going to remedy it? The government's been trying to remedy this situation and has only made it worse. Whenever we look at it, the government has only made situations like this worse in the past. And going through this way, going through the government, from the people who historically had the government against them, is definitely not the proper way to solve any issue. Thank you.
4 minutes, right? Okay. I'm about to go in a little bit, so bear with me. Okay. I'm going to start with the last thing he said. He ends with a nice little discussion of why reverse racism is the worst thing that has ever happened. I think we need to ask the question, why do white people that are mediocre as hell get to do whatever they want with their life? The answer is white supremacy. Why does Bush get to go to fucking whatever college he wants to? Because he's white. Because he's got a rich white family that he gets to inherit all of these beautiful privileges from. What do you understand about the ways that this racial history develops and makes this? You have no discussion of how Levittown, a place emblematic of the ways that racialized housing policies have kept black families and black people that go to this school from being able to attend this school, from being able to have the economic base to make something like this possible in the first instance. It's a laughable assumption that somehow this is emblematic of some radical way to resolve things. He talks about how economics first can solve it, and focusing on class will somehow resolve this. First, let's talk about what the black middle class is. Do you understand that the black middle class has a median income that is half of what the white middle class is? This is the way that we use statistics, which say the middle class, to make it so easy for us to cover shit up. This is the way that violence continues to function, because we refuse to understand the very specific and intricate statistics. We're the only ones that give you any statistic whatsoever. We indicated that when affirmative action existed, minority applications went up double and triple. When they went away, the applications went down 60%. Now he has it right that we need to talk about Berkeley a little bit. So let's talk about that. UC freshman yields were problematic because first, their studies didn't understand that admitted candidates' likelihood of choosing to enroll at private selective institutions with affirmative action instead of UC. Second, that UC's anomalous price advantage in the years, i.e. they dropped their price the same year that they got rid of affirmative action, meant it was more economical for people to go there. They're using statistics to try and blind you from the understanding that racism functions fundamentally through these processes, that there is no color blindness. The professor was quite right. There is no color blindness. What race shouldn't matter, but it does matter. So it's time that we take advantage of that and understand that, and take advantage of these issues that we can fundamentally attack. He says that there's stigmas that happen when black people get into affirmative action. There's stigma right now, homie. Don't you understand what's going on this campus? Let me read for you from the Campus Climate Survey. The results indicated that 58% of Afro-American faculty had said they experienced harassment, and 60% of students of color reported experiencing harassment. It's not just about Yik Yak. It's about that people are experiencing daily violence, that somebody feels that it's comfortable for them to roll up on a black person walking to their class and yell N-bombs out the window. This is the kind of shit that occurs every day on this campus. So why don't you understand that these are the political realities that we live in? That the fire is burning and you want to cover your eyes and pretend like nothing's happening. We're trying to put water on the fire, but it is failing. The professor is right, that there are constant drawbacks. People are trying to push back against affirmative action. Affirmative action is the only equal protection to rectify 450 years of genocide. Do we understand? Do you know why Africans are able to have better, like, why are you laughing about genocide, bro? Do you understand why Africans benefit? Because they have a nation and a home to go to. Do you know why Asians did better than black Americans? Because they had a home to go to, an economic base in their homeland. And American blacks don't have a home. This is their home, but they've been slaves in their home for 450 years. Don't you understand that this is about the economic bases and privileges that they come from? People that have a nation state to go from, that's why it affects these people. But it's not a reason to stop helping black Americans. Just because white women disproportionately get helped, just like every time in the past 50 years, does not mean that we should stop helping black people. They say there's no proof that affirmative action solves. I've already discussed why it has fundamentally. The Berkeley graduation stuff is a laughable joke. Think about the economics of that decision. Think about how the money decreased, the price that it cost to go to Berkeley decreased. But you know what happened? It pushed black people out fundamentally. What is it about? Why do we need to focus? Diversity is the only key to an educational and productive space for us to learn in. We need to understand that our university is implicated in a racial history, that we all live in a place that has a genocidal history up to 40 years ago. It continues today. So what do we do about it? What do you do about it? Thank you.
Alright, there's quite a lot in there. Hopefully I get to address most of it. I'll start with the last thing about genocide taking place today. Like, we can't talk if we're just going to redefine words. Genocide is when you're trying to murder an entire group of people. That's just not happening to blacks today. There's not a concerted effort to murder all the blacks in America. If we're going to redefine words, we can't even have a conversation. You're not trying to pour water on the fire, you're trying to pour gasoline by making up these fabrications. This just isn't the case that black people are getting the N-word shouted on them every day as they walk to campus. This just isn't happening. Like, I have black friends, I tell them, they're not getting the N-word shouted at them every day. You can just, like, make up these stories, but it's just not true. You, like, denigrated statistics multiple times in your talk. And statistics are like yes, like you can manipulate them and such, but they're better than just like these anecdotal stories that you could conjure up, and like we're just gonna like go at each other to anecdotes. At least with statistics, there's some sort of base from which you discuss something. And yes, after the affirmative action policies in California ended, more black people were actually able to graduate. They didn't have to drop out. They didn't have to deal with all the student debt and wasted time from attending these institutions. They're actually able to graduate and get jobs based on their education. As for black physicians, I've absolutely nothing to denigrate about black physicians. Ben Carson, in the 80s, he was in charge of an operation that, for the first time, separated twins conjoined at the head. This was something involving 20 surgeons. This was an incredibly complex operation. There's absolutely no reason that blacks can't be as good as surgeons as whites. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's that they should be admitted with the same standards, not different standards, the same standards. And they will be admitted because they're just as good. They're just as capable of achieving the same thing that white applicants to medical school are able to. It's true that people aren't colorblind. There's plenty of racism in America. It's true, if you just look at who people are friends with, people oftentimes prefer to be friends with people who look like them. That's totally true. But color blindness should be the ideal. We're not saying that we've achieved it. We're saying that it's the aspiration. We don't necessarily need affirmative action to become more diverse. People can get there on their own. As for the limits of how affirmative action has benefited middle-class women, there are more women in college today than men. and that disparity is increasing. And if you look at if you compare women who are in their 20s who don't have children to men that are in their 20s that don't have children, they actually make more than them, make more money than them. As for people being stuck in the same economic bracket as their parents, the top after a decade than you do of staying at the bottom. As for George Bush, he didn't get privilege because he's white. If you talk to your average white guy in Alabama who lives next to a meth lab, he doesn't get to go to Yale. His last name isn't Bush. His privileges are because his grandpa was a senator, because his dad was a vice president, the president, the CIA director. That's where his privilege comes from. It's not just from his skin color. And if you look at all these poor white people in Appalachia, I bet they're not going to feel very privileged. As for this term reverse racism, it is a bullshit term. There's no reverse racism. There's just racism. If you take a black person over an Asian person, just because that person is black and that person's Asian, you're just being racist against the Asian person. That's not reverse racism, that's just racism. As for this whole economic base, homeland thing, the Vietnamese boat people, they were kicked out of their country after the North conquered them, and they literally they fled with nothing, with just the clothes on their backs. They didn't have any sort of economic base, so that part's not true. Perfect.
I think that's it. Yeah. So you have your raffle tickets / voting tickets. You can vote for either the proposition, which is going to be
Why is it white?
yeah, okay, wait, guys. Listen. Right now you're going to vote. You have your tickets. The proposition, guys, proposition, raise your hand. So that's Professor Wiles and Trevor Reddick. And now the opposition is Daniel and Luke. Sorry. And so now you know who that is. Now you can vote and also write your name so you can win $100 or $50. Okay, quickly collect. Wait, let's do this systematically. You have to put in. I'll collect over there. You collect down here. You collect up there. You collect up there.
It's which side?
Well, I hope I didn't embarrass things.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your speech. I like the narrative approach to
Yeah,
statistics.
I figured he had done the statistics, and I had some bringing up the fact that you said, well, you wouldn't want a black man to operate on you that wasn't qualified.
Right.
It took 24 years the man that did the open heart surgery, name is the open heart, right? To become a surgeon. And Holmes, they kept saying, well, black men can't be surgeons.
Because
You know how to cook, you have your own talent, tap dance. Yeah. It's
Definitely.
still here.
yeah, I didn't know that they were the first black surgeons. That's a good fact to throw out.
And then my experience when I went to work, I began as a poet and published poet. I dropped out of school when I was 18 because my parents both died, man. My sister. I went back home. People don't realize that affirmative action is just one of the laws that covers discrimination. There's also laws, anybody over 40 is covered by a new law about age discrimination. Disabled are covered up by other laws. Not really this broadly defined threat to the white race.
Right.
Is what it's being made into, or to individuality.
This is how people understand what affirmative action is, which is not understanding what it actually is.
Exactly. And, I was able to get some of my point across. Because I should be somebody.
Hi, sorry, I'm Zach. I'm from West
Hey, that was submitted like 2 weeks ago now. I will find out whether it has been sent. I don't know 100% who to ask because by now I assume it's out of the SA's hands already, and that's where Cooper is dealing with it.
Right.
So I'll
just make sure it's out of the SA's hands.
Yeah.
So that way we can tell Scott what's going on. And Trevor?
Trevor, I believe his check should be if you haven't
He said all of the reimbursements for me will be submitted by tomorrow and he will continue to update me. He believes that Ithaca has been submitted and through the SA and is now in the Accumulation, and he says he believes Trevor's stuff is all in there.
I'm basically coming all the way.
For the $50 cash money prize.
It's literally all scrambled out of fairness.
All out fairness. Look at all of this.
All right, the winner of the $50 gift certificate is Matt Curry.
He's not here. No, he's not here.
Good luck.
Sean Tarzi.
$50.
Francis Leggari. It was 23 for the opposition and 37 for the affirmative. So the affirmative.